Chapter 34. Rosala wouldn't speak as she slipped through the shadows. She dismissed any questions with a wave of her hand.
"Quiet, and quick," she said. "Enemies about."
While Dane didn't trust the goblin, the previous night had proven that there was danger lurking on the streets of High Walls. He drew his dagger, concealing the dark blade against his forearm. Pierce retrieved his bow from Lay's pack and put an arrow to string. Lay drew the darkwood staff out of the depths of her pack. Rosala led them through a winding labyrinth of alleys. The streets grew narrower and narrower, and there were fewer and fewer bystanders to be seen. Eventually, the alley came to a dead end. A steel door was set into the final wall, but there were no signs of any sort of lock or handle. An arcane seal, Dane thought. No mere thief could open this door, for there was no lock to pick. The door was sealed with pure magical energy. Before Dane could say anything, Rosala barked a short phrase in a harsh, rasping tongue and traced a complex pattern on the front of the door. Sparkling light followed in the wake of her finger, and a moment later, the door swung open. Dane exchanged a glance with Lay. Rosala had already proven herself to be a talented pickpocket. She seemed to have a gift for sorcery as well. He wondered how old the girl actually was, and how she developed her skills. The steel door opened in a small bare chamber. The only feature was a hatch on the floor. Rosala lifted this trapdoor, revealing a long tunnel that dropped down into utter darkness. Rungs had been carved into the stone wall. It was impossible to see how far they extended.
"Down!" said Rosala.
"Wait," Dane said. "Just because you can see in the dark doesn't mean the rest of us can. Lay, a little light?" Lay brushed her fingers across her armor, and the studs began to radiate a golden glow. "Captain," Pierce said, studying the passage, "I will be unable to shift position within this tunnel. My presence may be a hindrance." He was right. Dane would have a hard time fitting into the tunnel. For Pierce, it would be all but impossible. "If you need me with you, I could—" "No, that's fine," Dane said. "Stay here. Hold this position until the 9th bell. If you can hear it from here—" "No, that's fine," Dane said. "Stay here. Hold this position until the 9th bell if you can hear it from here. If we haven't returned by then, go back to the Manticore." Pierce nodded and stepped out into the alley, an arrow to his bowstring, and a second tucked between his fingers. He calmly sighted down the alley and waited for an enemy to appear.
"Quickly!"
Rosala hissed. She had already started down the tunnel. Dane looked at Lay, then back at the tunnel. Sheathing his dagger, he climbed into the tunnel and began his descent. Lay dropped her staff into one of the unnaturally large pockets of her pack and followed close behind. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. "Where are we going, Rosala?" Dane asked.
"Down!"
"I noticed that."
"Cogs, sewers, undercity, beneath Sharn."
Ah, now they were getting somewhere. The cogs had been mentioned frequently during their earlier travels with Greykill. Many of Sharn's largest and least attractive industries were located beneath the city. Workhouses, tanneries, and foundries lay buried in the subterranean cogs. The sewers were even further below, and some said that there were ancient ruins hidden even below the sewers.
"Many passages to the depths were built long ago. Forgotten now?" but the quiet folk remember.
And would you care to tell me what we're doing down here?
You must see. What must we see?
Lay said from below.
You will see.
Oh, I see. No, you will see, Dane corrected.
Hush,
Razala said.
Many dangers lurk below. No time for laughter.
They continued the descent in silence. The stench was appalling. A stream of sewage and wastewater flowed down the center of the tunnel, and the walls were crusted with mold and filth. Lay's armor was the only source of light, and swarms of insects and other vermin scurried away from the circle of illumination.
Interesting,
Lay said, examining the design of the roof.
I've heard a lot about the design. Sharn's the largest city in Corvair, and the towers make traditional systems of plumbing difficulty to implement.
And the water is preserved in mugs of scented clay, Dane said.
Hush, Razala said. Almost there, but very dangerous.
Are all goblins such warriors? Dane said. There's no one anywhere to be seen. A grey ooze exploded out of the water in front of him. Wastewater dripped off of the creature as it dove for Dane. It was long and narrow, a strip of dull grey protoplasm almost 10 feet in length. It slammed into Dane, and he staggered back against the wall. He drew himself to the side just in time to avoid being caught in the coils of the monster. The creature snapped at him again, but this time he was ready. Darting beneath the tendril, he thrust his sword into the slimy mass. It felt like stabbing a bag filled with mud, but the creature pulled back.
Dureshka!
The goblin called out.
Grey Eater! Look to your blade! It burns!
Dane's eyes dropped to his sword, and he cursed. The blade was pitted and scarred, as if it had been exposed to powerful acid. A lesser blade might have been destroyed within a single stroke. The odds were poor that his sword would survive another attack. Dane saw Lay about to strike the ooze with her staff. "Lay, stop!" She paused, puzzled, and the creature struck, throwing him across the hallway. His left shoulder ached, and the acid began to eat away at cloak and armor. "It's covered with acid. We can't hit it." Dane rolled forward, dodging the next blow and rising to his feet in one fluid motion. He tried not to think about the sewage soaking his clothes.
So, what do we do?
Lay shrieked. He remembered the wand he'd taken from Daisy de Canith. He still had it, tucked in his belt. The Canith heir must have forgotten about it in the chaos. "Lay, catch!" he cried, tossing the shard-encrusted wooden wand to Lay. She caught the wand, but even as she did, the ooze caught Dane. The grey tentacle wrapped around his torso, constricting with terrible strength. He cried out in pain as a few drops of acid seeped below his armor. Dane didn't see what Lay did, but there was a brilliant flash of light. The creature spasmed, tightening its grip, and now the acid was burning his arms and chest. "Lay!" he gasped. There was another flash of light, and the pressure was gone. The ooze collapsed, dissolving and flowing away into the water. Dane collapsed, gasping, on the floor. His chainmail was ruined, and his cloak had been eaten away. "I guess I'll be buying a new cloak after all," he thought, wincing from the acid burns.
"Just sit still,"
Lay said. She drew a bloodstone shard out of her pouch and whispered to it, weaving an enchantment to neutralize the acid and heal the burns. It wasn't as quick or efficient as Jode's healing touch, but Dane breathed a sigh of relief as a relaxing numbness spread across his chest.
"You destroyed a Grey Eater,"
Razala said, and for an instant she was a child again.
"I've only seen it done once before."
What was it? Dane said, slowly getting to his feet and examining his sword.
Part of the sewer system, I think, Lay said. I told you it was fascinating. A living system for dissolving and disposing of the garbage that gets sent down here. It's always a race to find the treasures before the Durashka arrives, Rosala said. I hope we're not too late. Come, quickly.
She raced down the tunnel, and they followed as quickly as they could. A few minutes later, they came to the Midden Heap. It was a cavernous chamber. The walls and arched ceiling stretched far beyond the dim light of Lay's armor. Filthy water flowed around their feet, carrying waste down the passage they'd come from. Ahead of them was the heap. Dane had never seen so much garbage in one place. It was a mountain of filth and rotting material mixed with various scraps and damaged goods. As they walked forward, a cascade of rotten vegetables fell from the ceiling. Dane couldn't see the roof, but it seemed that there were a series of chutes that channeled waste down from the city. The heap was teeming with rats and insects, but the vermin had competition. Goblins. At least a dozen were crawling through the garbage, sifting through the refuse and looking for anything of value. They noticed a few more goblins standing near the entrances of the chamber, armed with makeshift clubs and spears. He imagined that these were scouts, watching for Grey Eaters or other dangers. Rosala approached one of the scouts. Speaking in the guttural tongue of the goblins, she said,
Are they safe?
The man nodded.
Pay him,
Rosala said to Dane. What?
Pay him. They mine the garbage to survive. He has something you must see. Pay him.
Look, Dane said, I appreciate that you may actually be trying to help us, but I don't have any money. Everything I had was stolen by a goblin who looks remarkably like you. So if you want me to pay him with my own coins, I'm afraid you've got them. Rosala watched Dane carefully. Then her hand darted into her robes, and when it emerged, she was holding a double crown. She tossed it to the sentinel without saying a word, and he led them deeper into the chamber. As they moved to the center of the chamber, the water grew deeper, coming up to the hips of the little goblins. Slowly, they made their way around the massive garbage heap, and that's when they saw the bodies. There were 4 corpses lined up along the Midden Heap. Their bodies were bloated from exposure to water, and they were in varying states of decomposition. The first was a dwarf whom Dane didn't recognize. The second was Jode. Lay cried out and sloshed forward through the water. Dane found himself at a loss. For a moment, he couldn't move. He couldn't think. He'd lost soldiers before, even friends, but this was Jode. He couldn't imagine a world without him. Lay knelt by the corpse and gasped. Dane made his legs move and staggered forward. Jode's skull had been caved in. Very little was left of the back of his head.
Who?
Lay said, her voice muted. She turned to look at Dane.
Why?
Dane was still in a daze. I told him, he said, more to himself than to Lay. I told him not to go.
Last night, they wanted him alive,
Lay cried.
Who would do this?
Dane turned away. He couldn't look at the corpse anymore. When was he found? He said.
Around the 6th bell,
said Rosala, glancing over at the scout for confirmation. He nodded.
They found all 4 of them together. It's rare for flesh to escape the notice of the Durashka, so they were not in the water for long. I thought you should know. I like the little one.
All 4 together? Did Jode go to meet these people? Dane walked over to the bodies. Lay was wiping the filth off of Jode's skin and clothes. Dane still couldn't bear the sight of his best friend's face, so he turned to examine the remaining 2 corpses. Once again, he found himself at a loss for words. He knew both of these people. One was Corlan, the half-orc he'd met in the company of Baal Tarkanan, and the other was Raciel Tan. Chapter 35. It was hard to focus with Jode's body lying there, but Dane had to push on. He knelt to examine the bodies. He was no expert, but Raciel's corpse seemed to be in worse condition than the others. Perhaps he'd died before the others. All the bodies had the same sort of massive head injuries as Jode, the backs of their skulls shattered, probably with a mace or a club. The skull cavity was almost completely empty. Raciel had a series of light raking cuts along his chest, claw marks most likely, and not deep enough to be lethal. The head wounds were the only ones that seemed significant. Dane searched the bodies, but neither was carrying anything. He turned back to the goblin scout. "Did this one have any possessions?" The goblin shook his head. "Are you certain? I can get you gold, if you have what I'm looking for." The mention of gold lit a fire in the goblin's eyes, but he shook his head again. "He had nothing," Dane cursed. He walked over to Lay. "Let's get out of here, Lay. We need to take him back to the surface." Lay said nothing. Her eyes were wide as she looked down at Jode. "What is it?"
Dane? His dragon mark. It's missing.
She was right. The mark of healing had been spread across Jode's head, a proud symbol of his magical gift. Despite the terrible wound, it was easy to see the mark was no longer there. "How is that possible?" Dane said. "Is it not really him?" They examined the body more closely, studying the forehead.
I don't know. But dragon marks don't disappear after death. They don't disappear ever.
She ran her hand across his face.
I'd like to believe this is some trick, but I don't think so.
A tear ran down her cheek as she looked at Dane.
The Sphinx said you'd suffer a loss today, Dane. She didn't say we all would.
Dane closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "We'll find out who did this, Lay. We'll make him pay. But right now, we have to keep moving. We'll mourn him when he's been avenged." She nodded, though her face was still a mask of sorrow.
I know.
"We need to find a way to carry him. Here." He took off the remnants of his ruined cloak. "Use this."
What about the others?
"We can't take them all. Let's worry about Jode." Lay nodded and wrapped Jode in the cloak. She whispered to the cloth. "What are you doing?" he asked.
Weaving an enchantment. It will keep his body from decomposing.
Leaving her to her business, Dane returned to Rosala. "Are you or your friends here looking to make a few more coins?"
Always,
the girl said cheerfully. "Then go to the Ilian apothecary in Dragon Towers, I think. You want to talk to a man named Baal. Tell him you found the corpses of 2 of his friends."
That we will do. But what of you? You claim to have no coin. Then you offer gold from stolen goods.
"I can get more money. Possibly a lot more. If you help us, you and your friends will get your reward." Rosala and the scout had a hushed exchange. Rosala turned back to Dane and nodded.
I will help you. If you need the quiet folk, I know where to find them.
"Good. I want to talk to whoever found these bodies. I need to see where they were found." "You'll be wanting Hazg," said the goblin scout. "I'll fetch that one. he waded away into the murky depths.
"Dane!" Lay called.
He turned back to her. She had stripped the wet rags off of Raciel and was studying his naked body. "What are you doing?" he said.
"He doesn't have a mark either, Dane."
"What do you mean?"
"According to Baal, their powers come from aberrant dragon marks. Raciel was supposed to be able to kill with a touch. So, where's his mark?"
Huh. Any more ideas?
"Perhaps. I need to get back to the Manticore."
What about Jode? Is he ready? Lay grimaced and indicated the cloth-wrapped bundle at the foot of the heap.
"I'll need your help."
Dane waded through the sewage and picked up the body of his friend. Lay took off her pack and opened it. A length of cord defined the size of the opening into the central compartment of the pack. Loosening the cord, she pulled at the mouth of the opening, creating a funnel-like cone.
"I think he'll fit,"
she said. She extended the opening toward Dane. Looking into the opening was like staring into deep black water. Dane could sense something there, but he could see nothing. Blinking back tears, Dane pushed Jode's body through the opening. There was a slight sensation of resistance, as if he was pushing the corpse through mud. Then it was gone, and so was Jode. Lay tightened the cord and buckled the pack. Hazg was a surly goblin with patchy hair and flaking gray skin. He spoke little, but moved with surprising speed along the slippery stone. He took them up one of the routing tunnels that brought waste into the central chamber. About 200 feet down the passage, a large chunk of rock had fallen from the ceiling. Hazg stopped and perched on the stone. "Yeah," he croaked, his voice rough and raspy. "The stones of recent fallen. Things been getting caught. Bodies was here." "My thanks, Hazg," Dane said. "Not wanting thanks." He rubbed thumb and forefinger together. Dane glanced at Rosala. She pouted and finally produced the crown for Hazg, who scampered back down the tunnel.
"When do I get more money?"
Rosala asked. "Why? Have you already spent all of mine?" Rosala showed no signs of shame.
"You shouldn't have made it so easy. Someone else would have taken it if I hadn't. You're lucky. If not for me, who'd be paying the quiet folk now?"
Dane decided not to argue the point. "Where does the waste in this tunnel come from?" Rosala looked around and spotted a few worn markings on the wall.
"High Walls and Kyber's Gate."
2 districts through this one tunnel?
"Kyber's Gate is under High Walls,"
Rosala said. She used her hands to indicate multiple levels.
"It's like the cogs, but there's not really any business there. Just rats, markets, and people fearing the light. It's wider than High Walls, and it goes deeper than ever here, down to old places where even the quiet folk don't go."
"And where's the nearest passage to the surface?"
"Not far. Want to go?"
Dane thought for a moment. "Do you know where it comes out?"
"No, but someone does, I'm sure. Shall I find out?"
Show us the way back first. Then find out and meet us at the Manticore in 2 hours. If it turns out to be dangerous, we'll want Pierce along. I'll have your gold. I hope."
"If you have the gold, I'll have your information,"
Rosala said, beaming. "Lead on, then." The 10th bell was ringing when they returned to the streets of High Walls. Rosala had stayed below to investigate the tunnels.
"How are you going to pay her?"
Lay asked. "Let me handle that. What was your thought on the missing dragon mark?"
"I should examine Jode and see what he can tell me. I'll need to make a divining rod. I should warn you, though, I can't do many more infusions tonight.
Dane nodded. I know. We'll need to be careful. But I'll never be able to sleep until we've done all we can. Sorrow crossed Lay's face.
I don't know if I'll be able to sleep in any case. It's... I keep trying to forget about it. To think that he'll be waiting for us at the Manticore.
Dane put his hand on her shoulder. Don't give up hope. If anyone could find a way to swindle the Keeper of Souls, it would be Jode. She nodded, but she had no cheerful words. Pierce was waiting in the common room when they arrived. General Dane, my lady, Lay. I have seen no signs of Jode. And Mistress Darcy says that he did not return in our absence. He paused. What became of your armor and clothing, Captain? Dane and Lay looked at one another. Jode is dead, Pierce. I don't understand. That's what the goblin needed to show us. She found Jode's body down in the sewers. Pierce was silent for a moment. Was he attacked by our enemies from yesterday evening? It seems likely. The sewer was fed from high walls, but we don't know how they found him or why they killed him. Yesterday they seemed to want him alive. Perhaps he did not have what they were looking for.
Perhaps,
Lay said. Pierce was silent again. His metal face gave no hint of his emotions. Finally, he said, There is no war here. This death has no purpose.
That may be where you're wrong, Lay said. One of you, help me back to our room.
Pierce, go with her. I have something else to attend to. Yes, Captain. Once Lay and Pierce had left, Dane found the innkeeper Darcy. Where's the nearest message station?
Half Stone Street in Black Arch, General. She smiled sweetly. Has there been any progress in establishing your credit?
Perhaps, he said. I'll tell you when I get back. Black Arch housed the garrison of Tavik's Landing. It was the most austere district Dane had been in yet. Located on the ground and close to the gates of Sharn, it was even more heavily fortified than Dagger Watch. It didn't take long for Dane to find what he was looking for, the crest of House Civis, hanging from a gilded board over a large black door. Even late at night, the message station was a bustle of activity. Gnomes were scurrying about, and the air was full of whispers. One entire wall was covered with bookshelves filled with identical black leather tomes. The opposite side of the room was dominated by 3 marble busts on high pedestals. The busts had the features of elderly sagacious gnomes with faceted dragon shards in place of eyes. 2 gnomes sat by each bust, each holding a quill and book. Occasionally, the gnomes would talk to the statue, but most of the time they seemed to sit and listen, furiously scribbling notes in their books. There were a few more chairs by the door. A woman wearing the courier's badge of House Orion was fast asleep in one chair, while a messenger in the livery of the Sharn Watch sat in another. The message stations of House Civis were the backbone of long-distance communication in Corvair. While they called it the Mark of Scribing, the dragon mark of House Civis related to all forms of communication. By speaking to the stone figure, a gnome could send a message across the continent. It was far from instantaneous, but still far faster than any human or beast. When the message reached the intended speaking stone, a gnome at the station would copy it down, either holding it for pickup or passing it to a courier for local delivery. Dane had heard that House Civis had developed its own language just for sending and recording messages. It wouldn't surprise him. The gnomes were obsessed with the security of their system. Dane approached the gnome spokesman. "Good evening, sir."
Good evening, sir,
the gnome said cheerfully.
Are you sending or receiving?
Sending, Dane said. Though, there is a complication. The gnome raised bushy eyebrows and waited for Dane to continue. I need to send a message at the recipient's expense. Well, sir, there are a few nations that have made such arrangements with the house, but unless you are an accredited member of the court in question, I'm afraid that I cannot. The message is for Alina Luridan Lyris. And what is it you wish to say? The speaker produced a parchment and quill, and smiled. Back at the Manticore, Pierce set Jode's body on one of the ragged pallets. He studied the terrible wound that had shattered his comrade's head. Whoever did this must be punished, he rumbled. Lay was rummaging through her backpack, pulling out mystical charms and sheafs of parchment. I never knew you to have a sense of vengeance, Pierce. This is not a matter of vengeance, my lady. This is war, and war is my purpose. She nodded. Then let it be mine as well. She saw a minotaur falling at her touch, a war-forged soldier collapsing into pieces, and for that moment, pure hatred chased away all sorrow. The moment passed, and she was left in the squalid room with her charms and her papers, and the corpse of her friend. She sighed, determined to hold back her tears. Lay spread her tools around the pallet. She took a wooden rod and whispered to it, weaving a minor spell of divination. When this task was completed, she found a flat shard of black crystal and etched the symbol of a skull into its surface. She set the stone disc aside. What are you doing, my lady? Pierce asked. Lay picked up the rod. First, I'm going to examine him more closely and search for any sort of mystical energies. Then, we'll see what he can tell us. She ran her fingers across the rod, activating the enchantments she'd placed within. Slowly, carefully, she passed the rod along the body. There is residual magical energy here. Ever so faint, but definitely there. She studied the shattered skull more closely, then gagged, dropping the wand. My lady, Pierce said, moving to take her shoulders. I'm all right, she said, returning to her feet. It's... She knelt again. Steeling herself, she examined the wound more closely. What is it? This injury. It's not what it appears. Lay picked up a small glowing crystal, illuminating the jagged edge of the wound. Look! This was caused by one or two powerful blows with a large blunt implement. Yes, Pierce said. But beneath, it looks as if his brain was removed before this injury occurred. There's no trace of brain matter against the inside of the skull. Why would someone do such a thing? I don't know, but it means he was dead before the crushing blow. That someone was trying to cover up that first injury. I can only assume that the killers were trying to hide the subtle wound with this savage blow. She shivered and picked up the disc of black crystal. Let's see if Jode can tell us. How could he do that? Lay positioned the disc on what remained of Jode's forehead. The enchantment I've woven within this stone will let us speak with Jode, if only for a few minutes. It's not really him, just the traces of his spirit left behind. But he should be able to tell us what happened, at least as much as he knew before. Lay was trying to hold things together, to focus on this as an academic challenge, but this was her friend, and she knew this was the last time she would ever speak to him. Pierce put his hand on her shoulder, and for a moment she clung to his arm, squeezing the cold metal as hard as she could. Then she took a deep breath and let go, moving back to the corpse. She touched the stone disc and unlocked the energies with a whisper, and thought. Jode, she said quietly, tell us who did this to you. The silence was absolute. Jode, she repeated.
Tell us, what was done to you?
Nothing.
Jode!
She screamed, though she knew he could not hear her.
Jode!
A moment later, Pierce was holding her, gently shaking her. Be calm, my lady. Your enchantment has failed. That is all. Be calm. Lay shook her head, touching the stone. She could feel the mystical energy still running through it.
No, no, that's not it. He's gone, Pierce. There's nothing there at all. It's all gone.
She grabbed hold of Pierce and clung to him, and her tears began to flow.
They didn't just take his mark. They destroyed him completely.
Chapter 36. It was almost the 11th bell by the time Dane returned to the Manticore. Pierce had draped the ruined cloak over Jode's body. Lay was studying sheets of parchment, her eyes still red with tears. Dane sat down on the empty pallet and removed the shreds of his chainmail shirt. What have you found?
His mark was removed, Lay said. Moreover, I think it was removed with these.
She pushed a sheet of parchment across the floor. It was the description of the deep dragon shards Alina wished to have returned.
The other day, I told you that such a shard might be able to bind the energies of a dragon mark, to create some sort of defense against the mark. I think someone managed to take that one step further. They drew out his mark, his spirit, everything that defined his mystical identity.
Briefly, she recounted the results of her autopsy. Dane drew his dagger while she was talking and slowly carving grooves in the floor. When she mentioned the missing brain, he slammed the dagger down, the adamantine blade passing through wood as if it were paper. He ground his teeth and pulled the dagger from the floor. He'd seen so many die over the past few years, and right now there was no time for sorrow or fury. He took a deep breath and set down the dagger. He drew his acid-scarred sword and laid it next to his armor. I need restoration. We may have a battle soon, and I don't want this shattering the moment I strike steel. Lay nodded and picked up the sword. As she ran her fingers along the blade, the metal began to flow and reform. Within moments, it had been restored to its original condition. Then she turned to the armor.
I'm going to have to stretch the metal to make do, she said. It won't be as strong as it was before.
Whatever you need to do, Dane said. There was a knock on the door. It was still too early for Rosala to show up. Dane snatched his restored sword and rolled over to the door. Remaining in a low crouch, he indicated that Pierce should open the door. As soon as there was enough space, his hand was through the opening, the point of his blade poised at the belly of their visitor. A human woman stood on the other side of the door. She was dressed in black leather and wool and carried a large satchel. The curious crest of House Orion was emblazoned above her heart. She didn't flinch or blink. Apparently, she was used to suspicious clients.
You would be Dane, she said.
That's me. Dane stood up. He lowered his sword, but not his guard. He had been expecting a courier, but after Jode's death, he couldn't be sure of anything. The courier's eyes flicked down to take in the Deneth symbol at the pommel of Dane's sword, and she nodded. Apparently, that had been mentioned as an identifying feature. She produced 2 objects from her satchel, a small leather pouch and a sealed letter, both of which she handed to Dane. Opening the pouch, Dane dug out a double crown and pressed it into her palm. A moment later, she had vanished.
"What was that?"
Lay said. She had just finished with Dane's armor. The links were thinner than they had been before, but at least it would cover his torso. Orient courier from Alina. He shook the pouch. We've got a purse of silver sovereigns. That should help buy the time of the goblins. I guess we'd better pay off Dacia as well. He broke the seal on the letter and unfolded the parchment. The message was written in an elegant, flowing script. With the passing of the former employee, you are to find the goods that he was carrying, regardless of what shape they may take, as these goods may be removed from the city. If you cannot resolve this matter within 2 days, I shall have to consider our new partnership to be a failure, which would be a tragedy for both of us. Good luck.
"Anything?"
said Lay. Not really. Alina wants the shards, regardless of what shape they may take, and if we can't settle the matter in a few days, she may get a bit upset.
"And this is a concern?"
She's hired us for this job because she needs outsiders. I don't think that the same restrictions would apply to disposing of ineffectual employees.
"I see."
You said you're about done for the day, right? Lay nodded.
"I could perform minor repairs, but that's about it. I need rest."
What about that wand? The one that destroyed that thing in the sewer? Lay reached into one of the side pockets of her pack and produced the wand. She tapped the row of dragon shards running along the shaft.
"Lightning discharge, powered by the embedded shards. But it's drained. It's going to take time for the energy to build up again."
So, if we're looking for a fight, said Dane, we should wait until morning. He paused, thinking. A lot will depend on what we find out from Rosala. For now, empty your pack. I want to see what else we've got available.
"All of it?"
Yes. He shrugged. It took a few minutes to pull everything out. Dane had forgotten how large the central compartment really was, but his memory had been correct, and he smiled. All right, Lay. Here's what I want you to do. 10 minutes later, Pierce, Rosala, and Dane were back on the streets of High Walls. The goblin and the warforged flowed across the streets like shadows. Despite his bulk, Pierce had been built for reconnaissance, and he moved with a fluid grace the bulkier warforged warriors couldn't match. Next to his companions, Dane felt clumsy and loud, as if he were a bear hunting in the company of panthers. After 5 minutes, Rosala came to a stop.
"Somewhere near the center," she said,
pointing. Are you sure? Dane said.
Yes. The tunnel comes up underneath, runs through Kyber's Gate, just like the Tunnel of Waste and Water. And a bad place is below down there. The quiet folk have lost scouts in that region before. Usually they lose to eaters or the red jackals, but there are worse things in Kyber's Gate, and I believe this is where at least one may live. The quiet folk, they won't go near to it.
Very good. Good job, Rosala. Here's your payment. He had tied the pouch of coins around his neck, but when he reached up, he found it was gone. Turning, he saw that Rosala was holding it out to him. She showed him the 2 sovereigns in her left hand.
I only took for my services, she said smugly. This time.
Dane sighed and took the purse. Rosala smiled and bowed, and a moment later, she was gone. Dane blinked. Was her disappearance the work of her skill and his own exhaustion? Or was magic involved? Whatever the answer, she was nowhere to be seen. Dane shook his head. Let's go, Pierce. I don't want to take this any further without daylight on our side, and I could use a good night's rest. As you wish, Captain. The 2 began walking back towards the manticore. Dane studied his warforged companion for a moment. You all right, Pierce? Captain? Dane gestured vaguely. Well, with Jode, it's just got me thinking about the troop. You served with me since I first accepted my commission. You've been everything a commander could ask for in a soldier, and you've never let me down. You've followed my every order without question, and I've come to rely on that. I am gratified to hear that, sir. But we're not in the army anymore, Pierce. I'm not your captain anymore. I'm just your companion. Your friend. I understand, but I am most comfortable operating under a military chain of command. You had a life before you entered the Syrian army. I did not. I was forged with the knowledge of war burned into my mind, and I was on the front lines within a week of my birth, if you can call it that. War is in my nature, and it will always be part of how I view the world. As long as you will have me, you will always be my captain. You served in the guard more than 4 times as long as I did. Don't you feel that you should be the one in charge? You don't understand, Captain. Humans are born without a purpose. You must find your own path in life. I was made to accomplish a specific task, and I have always known the nature of that task. I was not made to lead, and I have no desire to try. Dane shrugged. Fair enough. But Pierce, humans often think they know what they're supposed to do with their lives, and they aren't always right. Just because someone's told you what your purpose is supposed to be, are you sure it's the truth? I was born of design. I was made to excel at a specific task, and I would never be able to be as successful in another field. Is there a point to this discussion? I was just thinking about the Sphinx again. She said that you don't know your purpose yet. It seemed to me that you gave little credence to her words. I didn't, at the time, but now. Dane shook his head. After what we've seen tonight, I can't help but wonder about the other things she said. Pierce remained as impassive as ever. If I have another purpose, it may become clear in time. Until then, I am content. Very well, but Pierce, you don't talk much. I understand if you just don't have much to say, but if there is ever anything I can do, I want you to tell me. As you wish. Dane studied Pierce, but the Warforged had no expression to read. Dane still felt that there was something that Pierce wasn't talking about. Perhaps it was Jode's death. Dane had sent Pierce to watch Jode, and the Warforged might be blaming himself for the death of their friend. I'll just have to watch and wait, Dane decided. The first bell of the new day was ringing when they returned to the Manticore. Dane was exhausted. It had been a long day, and the coming dawn promised to be even more dangerous. The thought of bed, even a wretched pallet on the floor, called out to him. At this hour, Dane assumed that the common room of the Manticore would be empty, but he was mistaken. A single man was sitting at one of the tables, watching the door and drinking from a chipped mug. As Dane and Pierce entered the room, the visitor set down his mug and rose from his chair. It's about time you had arrived, Dane. And what trouble have you been getting into now? It was Grayson Ertala, captain of the Sharn watch.